Speak your mind, McNabbs, said Lady Helena. Since the beginning of the discussion, you have been only a listener and very sparing of your words. Since you ask my advice, said the Major, I will give it you frankly. I think Ayrton has spoken wisely and well, and I side with him. Such a reply was hardly looked for, as hitherto the Major had been strongly opposed to Ayrton's project. Ayrton himself was surprised, and gave a hasty glance at the Major. However, Paganel, Lady Helena, and the sailors were all of the same way of thinking, and since McNabbs had come over to his opinion, Glenarvan decided that the quartermaster's plan should be adopted in principle. And now, John, he added, don't you think yourself it would be prudent to encamp here, on the banks of the river Snowy, till we can get some means of conveyance? Yes, replied John Mangles, if our messenger can get across the Snowy when we cannot. All eyes were turned on the quartermaster, who said, with the air of a man who knew what he was about, the messenger will not cross the river. Indeed, said John Mangles. He will simply go back to the Lucknow road, which leads straight to Melbourne. Go 250 miles on foot, cried the young captain. On horseback, replied Ayrton. There is one horse sound enough at present. It will only be an affair of 4 days. Allow the Duncan 2 days more to get to the bay and 20 hours to get back to the camp, and in a week the messenger can be back with the entire crew of the vessel. The Major nodded approvingly as Ayrton spoke, to the profound astonishment of John Mangles. But as everyone was in favor of the plan, all there was to do was to carry it out as quickly as possible. Now then, friends, said Glenarvan, we must settle who is to be our messenger. It will be a fatiguing, perilous mission. I would not conceal the fact from you. Who is disposed, then, to sacrifice himself for his companions and carry our instructions to Melbourne? Wilson and Mulready, and also Paganel, John Mangles and Robert instantly offered their services. John particularly insisted that he should be entrusted with the business, but Ayrton, who had been silent till that moment, now said, with your honor's permission I will go myself. I am accustomed to all the country round. Many a time I have been across worse parts. I can go through where another would stick. I ask then, for the good of all, that I may be sent to Melbourne. A word from you will accredit me with your chief officer, and in 6 days I guarantee the Duncan shall be in Twofold Bay. That's well spoken, replied Glenarvan. You are a clever, daring fellow, and you will succeed. It was quite evident the quartermaster was the fittest man for the mission. All the rest withdrew from the competition. John Mangles made this one last objection, that the presence of Ayrton was necessary to discover traces of the Britannia or Harry Grant. But the Major justly observed that the expedition would remain on the banks of the Snowy till the return of Ayrton, that they had no idea of resuming their search without him, and that consequently his absence would not in the least prejudice the captain's interests. Well, go, Ayrton, said Glenarvan. Be as quick as you can and come back by Eden to our camp. A gleam of satisfaction shot across the quartermaster's face. He turned away his head, but not before John Mangles caught the look and instinctively felt his old distrust of Ayrton revive. The quartermaster made immediate preparations for departure, assisted by the 2 sailors, one of whom saw to the horse and the other to the provisions. Glenarvan, meantime, wrote his letter for Tom Austin. He ordered his chief officer to repair without delay to Twofold Bay. He introduced the quartermaster to him as a man worthy of all confidence. On arriving at the coast, Tom was to dispatch a detachment of sailors from the yacht under his orders. Glenarvan was just at this part of his letter, when McNabbs, who was following him with his eyes, asked him in a singular tone how he wrote Ayrton's name. Why, as it is pronounced, of course, replied Glenarvan. It is a mistake, replied the Major quietly. He pronounces it Ayrton, but he writes it Ben Joyce. Chapter 17, The Plot Unveiled. The revelation of Tom Ayrton's name was like a clap of thunder. Ayrton had started up quickly and grasped his revolver. A report was heard, and Glenarvan fell wounded by a ball. Gunshots resounded at the same time outside. John Mangles and the sailors, after their first surprise, would have seized Ben Joyce. But the bold convict had already disappeared and rejoined his gang scattered among the gum trees. The tent was no shelter against the balls. It was necessary to beat a retreat. Glenarvan was slightly wounded but could stand up. To the wagon, cried John Mangles, dragging Lady Helena and Mary Grant along, who were soon in safety behind the thick curtains. John and the Major, and Paganel and the sailors seized their carbines in readiness to repulse the convicts. Glenarvan and Robert went in beside the ladies, while Albinett rushed to the common defense. These events occurred with the rapidity of lightning. John Mangles watched the skirts of the wood attentively. The reports had ceased suddenly on the arrival of Ben Joyce. Profound silence had succeeded the noisy fusillade. A few wreaths of white smoke were still curling over the tops of the gum trees. The tall tufts of gastrolobium were motionless. All signs of attack had disappeared. The Major and John Mangles examined the wood closely as far as the great trees. The place was abandoned. Numerous footmarks were there and several half-burned caps were lying smoking on the ground. The Major, like a prudent man, extinguished these carefully, for a spark would be enough to kindle a tremendous conflagration in this forest of dry trees. "The convicts have disappeared," said John Mangles. "Yes," replied the Major, "and the disappearance of them makes me uneasy. I prefer seeing them face to face. Better to meet a tiger on the plain than a serpent in the grass. Let us beat the bushes all round the wagon." The Major and John hunted all round the country, but there was not a convict to be seen from the edge of the wood right down to the river. Ben Joyce and his gang seemed to have flown away like a flock of marauding birds. It was too sudden a disappearance to let the travelers feel perfectly safe. Consequently, they resolved to keep a sharp lookout. The wagon, a regular fortress buried in mud, was made the center of the camp, and two men mounted guard round it, who were relieved hour by hour. The first care of Lady Helena and Mary was to dress Glenarvan's wound. Lady Helena rushed toward him in terror as he fell down struck by Ben Joyce's ball. Controlling her agony, the courageous woman helped her husband into the wagon. Then his shoulder was bared, and the Major found, on examination, that the ball had only gone into the flesh, and there was no internal lesion. Neither bone nor muscle appeared to be injured. The wound bled profusely, but Glenarvan could use his fingers and forearm, and consequently there was no occasion for any uneasiness about the issue. As soon as his shoulder was dressed, he would not allow any more fuss to be made about himself, but at once entered on the business in hand. All the party, except Mulready and Wilson, who were on guard, were brought into the wagon, and the Major was asked to explain how this denouement had come about. Before commencing his recital, he told Lady Helena about the escape of the convicts at Perth and their appearance in Victoria, as also their complicity in the railway catastrophe. He handed her the Australian and New Zealand Gazette they had bought in Seymour, and added that a reward had been offered by the police for the apprehension of Ben Joyce, a redoubtable bandit, who had become a noted character during the last 18 months, for doing deeds of villainy and crime. But how had McNabbs found out that Ayrton and Ben Joyce were one and the same individual? This was the mystery to be unraveled, and the Major soon explained it. Ever since their first meeting, McNabbs had felt an instinctive distrust of the quartermaster. 2 or 3 insignificant facts, a hasty glance exchanged between him and the blacksmith at the Wimmera River, his unwillingness to cross towns and villages, his persistence about getting the Duncan summoned to the coast, the strange death of the animals entrusted to his care, and lastly, a want of frankness in all his behavior. All these details combined had awakened the Major's suspicions. However, he could not have brought any direct accusation against him till the events of the preceding evening had occurred. He then told of his experience. McNabbs, slipping between the tall shrubs, got within reach of the suspicious shadows he had noticed about half a mile away from the encampment. The phosphorescent firs emitted a faint light, by which he could discern 3 men examining marks on the ground, and one of the 3 was the blacksmith of Black Point. "It is them," said one of the men. "Yes," replied another, "there is the trefoil on the mark of the horseshoe. It has been like that since the Wimmera. All the horses are dead. The poison is not far off. There is enough to kill a regiment of cavalry. A useful plant, this gastrolobium." I heard them say this to each other, and then they were quite silent, but I did not know enough yet, so I followed them. Soon the conversation began again. "He is a clever fellow, this Ben Joyce," said the blacksmith. "A capital quartermaster with his invention of shipwreck. If his project succeeds, it will be a stroke of fortune. He is a very devil, is this Ayrton. Call him Ben Joyce, for he has well earned his name." And then the scoundrels left the forest. I had all the information I wanted now, and came back to the camp quite convinced, begging Paganel's pardon, that Australia does not reform criminals. This was all the Major's story, and his companions sat silently thinking over it. "Then Ayrton has dragged us here," said Glenarvan, pale with anger, "on purpose to rob and assassinate us." "For nothing else," replied the Major, "and ever since we left the Wimmera, His gang has been on our track and spying on us, waiting for a favorable opportunity. Yes. Then the wretch was never one of the sailors on the Britannia. He had stolen the name of Ayrton and the shipping papers. They were all looking at McNabbs for an answer, for he must have put the question to himself already. There is no great certainty about the matter, he replied, in his usual calm voice, but in my opinion the man's name is really Ayrton. Ben Joyce is his nom de guerre. It is an incontestable fact that he knew Harry Grant, and also that he was quartermaster on the Britannia. These facts were proved by the minute details given us by Ayrton, and are corroborated by the conversation between the convicts, which I repeated to you. We need not lose ourselves in vain conjectures, but consider it as certain that Ben Joyce is Ayrton, and that Ayrton is Ben Joyce. That is to say, one of the crew of the Britannia has turned leader of the convict gang. The explanations of McNabbs were accepted without discussion. Now then, said Glenarvan, will you tell us how and why Harry Grant's quartermaster comes to be in Australia? How, I don't know, replied McNabbs, and the police declare they are as ignorant on the subject as myself. Why, it is impossible to say. That is a mystery which the future may explain. The police are not even aware of Ayrton's identity with Ben Joyce, said John Mangles. You are right, John, replied the major, and this circumstance would throw light on their search. Then, I suppose, said Lady Helena, the wicked wretch had got work on Paddy O'Moore's farm with a criminal intent. There is not the least doubt of it. He was planning some evil design against the Irishman, when a better chance presented itself. Chance led us into his presence. He heard Paganel's story and all about the shipwreck, and the audacious fellow determined to act his part immediately. The expedition was decided on. At the Wimmera he found means of communicating with one of his gang, the blacksmith of Black Point, and left traces of our journey which might be easily recognized. The gang followed us. A poisonous plant enabled them gradually to kill our bullocks and horses. At the right moment he sunk us in the marshes of the Snowy, and gave us into the hands of his gang. Such was the history of Ben Joyce. The major had shown him up in his character, a bold and formidable criminal. His manifestly evil designs called for the utmost vigilance on the part of Glenarvan. Happily, the unmasked bandit was less to be feared than the traitor. But one serious consequence must come out of this revelation. No one had thought of it yet except Mary Grant. John Mangles was the first to notice her pale, despairing face. He understood what was passing in her mind at a glance. Miss Mary, he cried, you are crying. Crying, my child, said Lady Helena. My father, madam, my father, replied the poor girl. She could say no more, but the truth flashed on every mind. They all knew the cause of her grief, and why tears fell from her eyes and her father's name came to her lips. The discovery of Ayrton's treachery had destroyed all hope. The convict had invented a shipwreck to entrap Glenarvan. In the conversation overheard by McNabbs, the convicts had plainly said that the Britannia had never been wrecked on the rocks in Twofold Bay. Harry Grant had never set foot on the Australian continent. A second time they had been sent on the wrong track by an erroneous interpretation of the document. Gloomy silence fell on the whole party at the sight of the children's sorrow, and no one could find a cheering word to say. Robert was crying in his sister's arms. Paganel muttered in a tone of vexation, "That unlucky document, it may boast of having half-crazed a dozen people's wits." The worthy geographer was in such a rage with himself that he struck his forehead as if he would smash it in. Glenarvan went out to Mulready and Wilson, who were keeping watch. Profound silence reigned over the plain between the wood and the river. Ben Joyce and his band must be at considerable distance, for the atmosphere was in such a state of complete torpor that the slightest sound would have been heard. It was evident, from the flocks of birds on the lower branches of the trees, and the kangaroos feeding quietly on the young shoots, and a couple of emus whose confiding heads passed between the great clumps of bushes, that those peaceful solitudes were untroubled by the presence of human beings. You have neither seen nor heard anything for the last hour? Said Glenarvan to the two sailors. Nothing whatever, your honor, replied Wilson. The convicts must be miles away from here. They were not in numbers enough to attack us, I suppose, added Mulready. Ben Joyce will have gone to recruit his party, with some bandits like himself, among the bushrangers who may be lurking about the foot of the Alps. That is probably the case, Mulready, replied Glenarvan. The rascals are cowards, they know we are armed and well armed too. Perhaps they are waiting for nightfall to commence the attack. We must redouble our watchfulness. Oh, if we could only get out of this bog and down the coast, but this swollen river bars our passage. I would pay its weight in gold for a raft which would carry us over to the other side. Why does not your honor give orders for a raft to be constructed? We have plenty of wood. No, Wilson, replied Glenarvan. This Snowy is not a river, it is an impassable torrent. John Mangles, the major, and Paganel just then came out of the wagon on purpose to examine the state of the river. They found it still so swollen by the heavy rain that the water was a foot above the level. It formed an impetuous current, like the American rapids. To venture over that foaming current and that rushing flood, broken into 1,000 eddies and hollows and gulfs, was impossible. John Mangles declared the passage impracticable. But we must not stay here, he added, without attempting anything. What we were going to do before Ayrton's treachery is still more necessary now. What do you mean, John? Asked Glenarvan. I mean that our need is urgent, and that since we cannot go to Twofold Bay, we must go to Melbourne. We have still one horse. Give it to me, my lord, and I will go to Melbourne. But that will be a dangerous venture, John, said Glenarvan. Not to speak of the perils of a journey of 200 miles over an unknown country, the road and the byways will be guarded by the accomplices of Ben Joyce. I know it, my lord, but I know also that things can't stay long as they are. Ayrton only asked a week's absence to fetch the crew of the Duncan, and I will be back to the Snowy River in 6 days. Well, my lord, what are your commands? Before Glenarvan decides, said Paganel, I must make an observation. That someone must go to Melbourne is evident, but that John Mangles should be the one to expose himself to the risk cannot be. He is the captain of the Duncan, and must be careful of his life. I will go instead. That is all very well, Paganel, said the major, but why should you be the one to go? Are we not here? Said Mulrady and Wilson. And do you think, replied McNabbs, that a journey of 200 miles on horseback frightens me? Friends, said Glenarvan, one of us must go, so let it be decided by drawing lots. Write all our names, Paganel. Not yours, my lord, said John Mangles. And why not? What, separate you from Lady Helena, and before your wound is healed too? Glenarvan, said Paganel, you cannot leave the expedition. No, added the major. Your place is here, Edward, you ought not to go. Danger is involved in it, said Glenarvan, and I will take my share along with the rest. Write the names, Paganel, and put mine among them, and I hope the lot may fall on me. His will was obeyed, the names were written and the lots drawn, fate fixed on Mulrady. The brave sailor shouted hurrah and said, My lord, I am ready to start. Glenarvan pressed his hand and then went back to the wagon, leaving John Mangles and the major on watch. Lady Helena was informed of the determination to send a message to Melbourne, and that they had drawn lots who should go, and Mulrady had been chosen. Lady Helena said a few kind words to the brave sailor, which went straight to his heart. Fate could hardly have chosen a better man, for he was not only brave and intelligent, but robust and superior to all fatigue. Mulrady's departure was fixed for 8 o'clock, immediately after the short twilight. Wilson undertook to get the horse ready. He had a project in his head of changing the horse's left shoe for one off the horses that had died in the night. This would prevent the convicts from tracking Mulrady or following him, as they were not mounted. While Wilson was arranging this, Glenarvan got his letter ready for Tom Austin, but his wounded arm troubled him, and he asked Paganel to write it for him. The savant was so absorbed in one fixed idea that he seemed hardly to know what he was about. In all this succession of vexations, it must be said the document was always uppermost in Paganel's mind. He was always worrying himself about each word, trying to discover some new meaning, and losing the wrong interpretation of it, and going over and over himself in perplexities. He did not hear Glenarvan when he first spoke, but on the request being made a second time, he said, Ah, very well, I'm ready. While he spoke, he was mechanically getting paper from his notebook. He tore a blank page off and sat down pencil in hand to write. Glenarvan began to dictate as follows. Order to Tom Austin, chief officer, to get to sea without delay and bring the Duncan to. Paganel was just finishing the last word when his eye chanced to fall on the Australian and New Zealand Gazette lying on the ground. The paper was so folded that only the last 2 syllables of the title were visible. Paganel's pencil stopped, and he seemed to become oblivious of Glenarvan and the letter entirely, till his friends called out, Come, Paganel. "Ah," said the geographer with a loud exclamation. "What is the matter?" asked the major. "Nothing, nothing," replied Paganel. Then he muttered to himself, "Alland, Alland, Alland." He had got up and seized the newspaper. He shook it in his efforts to keep back the words that involuntarily rose to his lips. Lady Helena, Mary, Robert, and Glenarvan gazed at him in astonishment, at a loss to understand this unaccountable agitation. Paganel looked as if a sudden fit of insanity had come over him. But his excitement did not last. He became by degrees calmer. The gleam of joy that shone in his eyes died away. He sat down again and said quietly, "When you please, my lord, I am ready." Glenarvan resumed his dictation at once, and the letter was soon completed. It read as follows: Order to Tom Austin to go to sea without delay, and take the Duncan to Melbourne by the 37th degree of latitude to the eastern coast of Australia. "Of Australia," said Paganel. "Ah yes, of Australia." Then he finished the letter, and gave it to Glenarvan to sign, who went through the necessary formality as well as he could, and closed and sealed the letter. Paganel, whose hand still trembled with emotion, directed it thus: Tom Austin, chief officer on board the yacht Duncan, Melbourne. Then he got up and went out of the wagon, gesticulating and repeating the incomprehensible words. Alland, Alland, Alland. Chapter 18, 4 Days of Anguish. The rest of the day passed on without any further incident. All the preparations for Mulready's journey were completed, and the brave sailor rejoiced in being able to give his lordship this proof of devotion. Paganel had recovered his usual sang-froid and manners. His look, indeed, betrayed his preoccupation, but he seemed resolved to keep it secret. No doubt he had strong reasons for this course of action, for the major heard him repeating, like a man struggling with himself, "No, no, they would not believe it. And besides, what good would it be? It is too late." Having taken this resolution, he busied himself with giving Mulready the necessary directions for getting to Melbourne, and showed him his way on the map. All the tracks, that is to say, paths through the prairie, came out on the road to Lucknow. This road, after running right down to the coast, took a sudden bend in the direction of Melbourne. This was the route that must be followed steadily, for it would not do to attempt a short cut across an almost unknown country. Nothing, consequently, could be more simple. Mulready could not lose his way. As to dangers, there were none after he had gone a few miles beyond the encampment, out of the reach of Ben Joyce and his gang. Once past their hiding place, Mulready was certain of soon being able to outdistance the convicts and execute his important mission successfully. At 6 o'clock they all dined together. The rain was falling in torrents. The tent was not protection enough, and the whole party had to take refuge in the wagon. This was a sure refuge. The clay kept it firmly embedded in the soil, like a fortress resting on sure foundations. The arsenal was composed of 7 carbines and 7 revolvers, and could stand a pretty long siege, for they had plenty of ammunition and provisions. But before 6 days were over, the Duncan would anchor in Twofold Bay, and 24 hours after her crew would reach the other shore of the Snowy River. And should the passage still remain impracticable, the convicts at any rate would be forced to retire before the increased strength. But all depended on Mulready's success in his perilous enterprise. At 8 o'clock it got very dark. Now was the time to start. The horse prepared for Mulready was brought out. His feet, by way of extra precaution, were wrapped round with cloths, so that they could not make the least noise on the ground. The animal seemed tired, and yet the safety of all depended on his strength and surefootedness. The major advised Mulready to let him go gently as soon as he got past the convicts. Better delay half a day than not arrive safely. John Mangles gave his sailor a revolver, which he had loaded with the utmost care. This is a formidable weapon in the hand of a man who does not tremble, for 6 shots fired in a few seconds would easily clear a road infested with criminals. Mulready seated himself in the saddle ready to start. "Here is the letter you are to give to Tom Austin," said Glenarvan. "Don't let him lose an hour. He is to sail for Twofold Bay at once, and if he does not find us there, if we have not managed to cross the Snowy, let him come on to us without delay. Now go, my brave sailor, and God be with you." He shook hands with him and bade him goodbye, and so did Lady Helena and Mary Grant. A more timorous man than the sailor would have shrunk back a little from setting out on such a dark, raining night on an errand so full of danger, across vast, unknown wilds. But his farewells were calmly spoken, and he speedily disappeared down a path which skirted the wood. At the same moment, the gusts of wind redoubled their violence. The high branches of the eucalyptus clattered together noisily, and bough after bough fell on the wet ground. More than one great tree, with no living sap but still standing hitherto, fell with a crash during this storm. The wind howled amid the cracking wood and mingled its moans with the ominous roaring of the rain. The heavy clouds, driving along toward the east, hung on the ground like rays of vapor, and deep, cheerless gloom intensified the horrors of the night. The travelers went back into the wagon immediately Mulready had gone. Lady Helena, Mary Grant, Glenarvan, and Paganel occupied the first compartment, which had been hermetically closed. The second was occupied by Albinett, Wilson, and Robert. The Major and John Mangles were on duty outside. This precaution was necessary, for an attack on the part of the convicts would be easy enough, and therefore probable enough. The two faithful guardians kept close watch, bearing philosophically the rain and wind that beat on their faces. They tried to pierce through the darkness so favorable to ambushes, for nothing could be heard but the noise of the tempest, the sough of the wind, the rattling branches, falling trees, and roaring of the unchained waters. At times, the wind would cease for a few moments, as if to take breath. Nothing was audible but the moan of the snowy river as it flowed between the motionless reeds and the dark curtain of gum trees. The silence seemed deeper in these momentary lulls, and the Major and John Mangles listened attentively. During one of these calms, a sharp whistle reached them. John Mangles went hurriedly up to the Major. "You heard that?" he asked. "Yes," said McNabbs. "Is it man or beast?" "A man," replied John Mangles. And then both listened. The mysterious whistle was repeated and answered by a kind of report, but almost indistinguishable, for the storm was raging with renewed violence. McNabbs and John Mangles could not hear themselves speak. They went for comfort under the shelter of the wagon. At this moment the leather curtains were raised and Glenarvan rejoined his two companions. He too had heard this ill-boding whistle and the report which echoed under the tilt. "Which way was it?" asked he. "There," said John, pointing to the dark track in the direction taken by Mulready. "How far?" "The wind brought it, I should think, 3 or 4 miles at least." "Come," said Glenarvan, putting his gun on his shoulder. "No," said the Major, "it is a decoy to get us away from the wagon." "But if Mulready has even now fallen beneath the blows of these rascals," exclaimed Glenarvan, seizing McNabbs by the hand. "We shall know by tomorrow," said the Major, coolly, determined to prevent Glenarvan from taking a step which was equally rash and futile. "You cannot leave the camp, my lord," said John. "I will go alone." "You will do nothing of the kind," cried McNabbs energetically. "Do you want to have us killed one by one to diminish our force and put us at the mercy of these wretches? If Mulready has fallen a victim to them, it is a misfortune that must not be repeated. Mulready was sent, chosen by chance. If the lot had fallen to me, I should have gone as he did, but I should neither have asked nor expected assistance." In restraining Glenarvan and John Mangles, the Major was right in every aspect of the case. To attempt to follow the sailor, to run in the darkness of night among the convicts in their leafy ambush was madness, and more than that, it was useless. Glenarvan's party was not so numerous that it could afford to sacrifice another member of it. Still Glenarvan seemed as if he could not yield. His hand was always on his carbine. He wandered about the wagon and bent a listening ear to the faintest sound. The thought that one of his men was perhaps mortally wounded, abandoned to his fate, calling in vain on those for whose sake he had gone forth, was a torture to him. McNabbs was not sure that he should be able to restrain him, or if Glenarvan, carried away by his feelings, would not run into the arms of Ben Joyce. "Edward," said he, "be calm. Listen to me as a friend. Think of Lady Helena, of Mary Grant, of all who are left. And besides, where would you go? Where would you find Mulready? He must have been attacked 2 miles off. In what direction? Which track would you follow?" At that very moment, as if to answer the Major, a cry of distress was heard. "Listen," said Glenarvan. This cry came from the same quarter as the report, but less than 1/4 of a mile off. Glenarvan, repulsing McNabbs, was already on the track, when at 300 paces from the wagon they heard the exclamation, "Help, help!" The voice was plaintive and despairing. John Mangles and the Major sprang toward the spot. A few seconds after they perceived among the scrub a human form dragging itself along the ground and uttering mournful groans. It was Mulready, wounded, apparently dying, and when his companions raised him, they felt their hands bathed in blood. The rain came down with redoubled violence, and the wind raged among the branches of the dead trees. In the pelting storm, Glenarvan, the Major and John Mangles transported the body of Mulready. On their arrival, everyone got up. Paganel, Robert, Wilson, and Albinett left the wagon, and Lady Helena gave up her compartment to poor Mulready. The Major removed the poor fellow's flannel shirt, which was dripping with blood and rain. He soon found the wound. It was a stab in the right side. McNabbs dressed it with great skill. He could not tell whether the weapon had touched any vital part. An intermittent jet of scarlet blood flowed from it. The patient's paleness and weakness showed that he was seriously injured. The major washed the wound first with fresh water, and then closed the orifice. After this, he put on a thick pad of lint, and then folds of scraped linen held firmly in place with a bandage. He succeeded in stopping the hemorrhage. Mulready was laid on his side, with his head and chest well raised, and Lady Helena succeeded in making him swallow a few drops of water. After about a quarter of an hour, the wounded man, who till then had lain motionless, made a slight movement. His eyes unclosed, his lips muttered incoherent words, and the major, bending toward him, heard him repeating, "My lord, the letter Ben Joyce." The major repeated these words and looked at his companions. What did Mulready mean? Ben Joyce had been the attacking party, of course, but why? Surely for the express purpose of intercepting him and preventing his arrival at the Duncan. This letter. Glenarvan searched Mulready's pockets. The letter addressed to Tom Austin was gone. The night wore away amid anxiety and distress. Every moment, they feared, would be poor Mulready's last. He suffered from acute fever. The Sisters of Charity, Lady Helena and Mary Grant, never left him. Never was patient so well tended, nor by such sympathetic hands. Day came and the rain had ceased. Great clouds filled the sky still. The ground was strewn with broken branches. The marly soil, soaked by the torrents of rain, had yielded still more. The approaches to the wagon became difficult, but it could not sink any deeper. John Mangles, Paganel, and Glenarvan went, as soon as it was light enough, to reconnoiter in the neighborhood of the encampment. They revisited the track, which was still stained with blood. They saw no vestige of Ben Joyce, nor of his band. They penetrated as far as the scene of the attack. Here 2 corpses lay on the ground, struck down by Mulready's bullets. One was the blacksmith of Blackpaint. His face, already changed by death, was a dreadful spectacle. Glenarvan searched no further. Prudence forbade him to wander from the camp. He returned to the wagon, deeply absorbed by the critical position of affairs. "We must not think of sending another messenger to Melbourne," said he. "But we must," said John Mangles, "and I must try to pass where my sailor could not succeed." "No, John, it is out of the question. You have not even a horse for the journey, which is full 200 miles. This was true, for Mulready's horse, the only one that remained, had not returned. Had he fallen during the attack on his rider, or was he straying in the bush, or had the convicts carried him off? "Come what will," replied Glenarvan, "we will not separate again. Let us wait a week or a fortnight till the Snowy falls to its normal level. We can then reach Twofold Bay by short stages, and from there we can send on to the Duncan, by a safer channel, the order to meet us." "That seems the only plan," said Paganel. "Therefore, my friends," rejoined Glenarvan, "no more parting. It is too great a risk for one man to venture alone into a robber-haunted waste. And now, may God save our poor sailor and protect the rest of us." Glenarvan was right in both points. First, in prohibiting all isolated attempts, and second, in deciding to wait till the passage of the Snowy River was practicable. He was scarcely 30 miles from Delegate, the first frontier village of New South Wales, where he would easily find the means of transport to Twofold Bay, and from there he could telegraph to Melbourne his orders about the Duncan. These measures were wise, but how late? If Glenarvan had not sent Mulready to Lucknow, what misfortunes would have been averted, not to speak of the assassination of the sailor. When he reached the camp, he found his companions in better spirits. They seemed more hopeful than before. He is better," cried Robert, running out to meet Lord Glenarvan. "Mulready." "Yes, Edward," answered Lady Helena. "A reaction has set in. The major is more confident. Our sailor will live." "Where is McNabbs?" asked Glenarvan. "With him. Mulready wanted to speak to him, and they must not be disturbed." He then learned that about an hour since, the wounded man had awakened from his lethargy, and the fever had abated. But the first thing he did on recovering his memory and speech was to ask for Lord Glenarvan, or, failing him, the major. McNabbs, seeing him so weak, would have forbidden any conversation, but Mulready insisted with such energy that the major had to give in. The interview had already lasted some minutes when Glenarvan returned. There was nothing for it but to await the return of McNabbs. Presently the leather curtains of the wagon moved, and the major appeared. He rejoined his friends at the foot of a gum tree, where the tent was placed. His face, usually so stolid, showed that something disturbed him. When his eyes fell on Lady Helena and the young girl, his glance was full of sorrow. Glenarvan questioned him, and extracted the following information. When he left the camp, Mulready followed one of the paths indicated by Paganel. He made as good speed as the darkness of the night would allow. He reckoned that he had gone about 2 miles when several men, 5, he thought, sprang to his horse's head. The animal reared. Mulready seized his revolver and fired. He thought he saw 2 of his assailants fall. By the flash he recognized Ben Joyce. But that was all. He had not time to fire all the barrels. He felt a violent blow on his side and was thrown to the ground. Still he did not lose consciousness. The murderers thought he was dead. He felt them search his pockets and then heard one of them say, "I have the letter." "Give it to me," returned Ben Joyce, "and now the Duncan is ours." At this point of the story, Glenarvan could not help uttering a cry. McNabbs continued, "Now you fellows," added Ben Joyce, "catch the horse. In 2 days I shall be on board the Duncan, and in 6 I shall reach Twofold Bay. This is to be the rendezvous. My lord and his party will be still stuck in the marshes of the Snowy River. Cross the river at the bridge of Kemple Pier, proceed to the coast, and wait for me. I will easily manage to get you on board. Once at sea in a craft like the Duncan, we shall be masters of the Indian Ocean." "Hurrah for Ben Joyce!" cried the convicts. Mulready's horse was brought, and Ben Joyce disappeared, galloping on the Lucknow road, while the band took the road southeast of the Snowy River. Mulready, though severely wounded, had the strength to drag himself to within 300 paces from the camp, whence we found him almost dead. "There," said McNabbs, "is the history of Mulready, and now you can understand why the brave fellow was so determined to speak." This revelation terrified Glenarvan and the rest of the party. "Pirates, pirates!" cried Glenarvan. "My crew massacred, my Duncan in the hands of these bandits." "Yes, for Ben Joyce will surprise the ship," said the major, and then, "Well, we must get to the coast first," said Paganel. "But how are we to cross the Snowy River?" said Wilson. "As they will," replied Glenarvan. "They are to cross at Kemple Pier Bridge, and so will we." "But about Mulready?" asked Lady Helena. "We will carry him. We will have relays. Can I leave my crew to the mercy of Ben Joyce and his gang?" To cross the Snowy River at Kemple Pier was practicable, but dangerous. The convicts might entrench themselves at that point and defend it. They were at least 30 against 7, but there are moments when people do not deliberate, or when they have no choice but to go on. "My lord," said John Mangles, "before we throw away our chance, before venturing to this bridge, we ought to reconnoiter, and I will undertake it." "I will go with you, John," said Paganel. This proposal was agreed to, and John Mangles and Paganel prepared to start immediately. They were to follow the course of the Snowy River, follow its banks till they reached the place indicated by Ben Joyce, and especially they were to keep out of sight of the convicts, who were probably scouring the bush. So the 2 brave comrades started, well provisioned and well armed, and were soon out of sight as they threaded their way among the tall reeds by the river. The rest anxiously awaited their return all day. Evening came, and still the scouts did not return. They began to be seriously alarmed. At last, toward 11 o'clock, Wilson announced their arrival. Paganel and John Mangles were worn out with the fatigues of a 10-mile walk. "Well, what about the bridge? Did you find it?" asked Glenarvan with impetuous eagerness. "Yes, a bridge of supple jacks," said John Mangles. "The convicts passed over, but—" "But what?" said Glenarvan, who foreboded some new misfortune. "They burned it after they passed," said Paganel. Chapter 19, Helpless and Hopeless. It was not a time for despair, but action. The bridge at Kemple Pier was destroyed, but the Snowy River must be crossed, come what might, and they must reach Twofold Bay before Ben Joyce and his gang. So, instead of wasting time in empty words, the next day, the 16th of January, John Mangles and Glenarvan went down to examine the river and arrange for the passage over. The swollen and tumultuous waters had not gone down the least. They rushed on with indescribable fury. It would be risking life to battle with them. Glenarvan stood gazing with folded arms and downcast face. "Would you like me to try and swim across?" said John Mangles. "No, John, no," said Lord Glenarvan, holding back the bold, daring young fellow. "Let us wait." And they both returned to the camp. The day passed in the most intense anxiety. 10 times Lord Glenarvan went to look at the river, trying to invent some bold way of getting over, but in vain. Had a torrent of lava rushed between the shores, it could not have been more impassable. During these long wasted hours, Lady Helena, under the Major's advice, was nursing Mulready with the utmost skill. The sailor felt a throb of returning life. McNabbs ventured to affirm that no vital part was injured. Loss of blood accounted for the patient's extreme exhaustion. The wound once closed and the hemorrhage stopped. Time and rest would be all that was needed to complete his cure. Lady Helena had insisted on giving up the first compartment of the wagon to him, which greatly tried his modesty. The poor fellow's greatest trouble was the delay his condition might cause Glenarvan, and he made him promise that they should leave him in the camp under Wilson's care, should the passage of the river become practicable. But unfortunately, no passage was practicable. Either that day or the next, January 17, Glenarvan was in despair. Lady Helena and the Major vainly tried to calm him and preached patience. Patience, indeed, when perhaps at this very moment Ben Joyce was boarding the yacht. When the Duncan, loosing from her moorings, was getting up steam to reach the fatal coast, and each hour was bringing her nearer. John Mangles felt in his own breast all that Glenarvan was suffering. He determined to conquer the difficulty at any price, and constructed a canoe in the Australian manner, with large sheets of bark of the gum trees. These sheets were kept together by bars of wood, and formed a very fragile boat. The captain and the sailor made a trial trip in it during the day. All that skill and strength and tact and courage could do they did, but they were scarcely in the current before they were upside down, and nearly paid with their lives for the dangerous experiment. The boat disappeared, dragged down by the eddy. John Mangles and Wilson had not gone 10 fathoms, and the river was a mile broad, and swollen by the heavy rains and melted snows. Thus passed the 19th of January. The Major and Glenarvan went 5 miles up the river in search of a favorable passage, but everywhere they found the same roaring, rushing, impetuous torrent. The whole southern slope of the Australian Alps poured its liquid masses into this single bed. All hope of saving the Duncan was now at an end. 5 days had elapsed since the departure of Ben Joyce. The yacht must be at this moment at the coast and in the hands of the convicts. However, it was impossible that this state of things could last. The temporary influx would soon be exhausted, and the violence also. Indeed, on the morning of the 21st, Paganel announced that the water was already lower. "What does it matter now?" said Glenarvan. "It is too late." "That is no reason for our staying longer here," said the Major. "Certainly not," replied John Mangles. "Perhaps tomorrow the river may be practicable." "And will that save my unhappy men?" cried Glenarvan. "Will your lordship listen to me?" returned John Mangles. "I know Tom Austin. He would execute your orders and set out as soon as departure was possible. But who knows whether the Duncan was ready and her injury repaired on the arrival of Ben Joyce? And suppose the yacht could not go to sea? Suppose there was a delay of a day or 2 days? "You are right, John," replied Glenarvan. "We must get to Twofold Bay. We are only 35 miles from Delegate." "Yes," added Paganel, "and that's a town where we shall find rapid means of conveyance. Who knows whether we shan't arrive in time to prevent a catastrophe?" "Let us start," cried Glenarvan. John Mangles and Wilson instantly set to work to construct a canoe of larger dimensions. Experience had proved that the bark was powerless against the violence of the torrent, and John accordingly felled some of the gum trees and made a rude but solid raft with the trunks. It was a long task, and the day had gone before the work was ended. It was completed next morning.